advocates behind you shaking their heads the whole time when you were saying.
How you doing? Yes.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the House Environment and Transportation Committee. We have a full afternoon of briefings followed by bill hearings. First up is our annual State of the Bay briefing. So let me ask the Chesapeake Bay Commission and the Chesapeake Bay Foundation to come up to the table. And we appreciate you being here to let us know what's going on with our treasured state and regional assets. So please begin when you're ready.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, for inviting us here today to join you to provide that update on the Chesapeake Bay restoration effort. While we get those slides up, my name is Anna Achilles. I am the Executive Director of the Chesapeake Bay Commission, and I am joined today by our Maryland State Director, Mark Hoffman. My goal in this presentation is to quickly orient you to the Commission, to the Bay program, where we are in meeting our Bay restoration goals, and then some of the challenges ahead for our partnership. My hope is to provide that as a solid foundation before you hear the foundation's perspective on how to approach those challenges moving forward. So I'll start with who I am representing for you here today, the Chesapeake Bay Commission. There are many Chesapeake Bay fill in the blanks, so this one is the Commission. We are a tri-state quasi-legislative body created by you, the legislators of 3 Bay states, Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. The very first assessments of the Bay health and future made clear the important role that our legislative bodies were going to need to play in achieving our success. We are, in effect, the legislative voice within the Bay Program Partnership. We have 21 members, 7 from each of those states, and a liaison from the Department of Defense. 5 of our members from each state are state legislators. Here in Maryland, Delegate Dana Stein is Maryland's chair this year. Senator Guy Gazzoni is our vice chair. Delegates Sarah Love and Julian Ivey are joined by Senator Sarah Elfreth to complete our ranks from Maryland. They are joined by Secretary Josh Kurtz on behalf of the governor and Vince Leggett as our citizen member. Together, the Commission translates science into coordinated policy at the state and federal level. We advise Congress on the needs of the Bay program, and we are a member of the Bay Program Executive Council, a signatory of all of the Bay agreements to date, and we sit at the center of that restoration partnership with those other signatories. So here's our next Chesapeake Bay fill in the blank, the program. The program is made up of 9 formal partners, the 6 watershed states, the District of Columbia, EPA, representing all of the core federal agencies, and the Commission. These are the decision makers who are pushing restoration efforts forward and accountable for meeting the goals that we set. But the truth is there are millions of people throughout our watershed that are making this work possible. Everybody from homeowners who are installing rain gardens, municipalities investing in water infrastructure, farmers installing conservation practices, NGOs leveraging public and private dollars to make our work go farther. Together, we have been at this for over 40 years. The first Bay Agreement was signed 40 years ago, this last December. We are 10 years into the current agreement from 2014. We are 2 years away from when the goals in that agreement are supposed to come due. And even as we continue to make progress, we are learning a lot about the challenges we are facing. So I'm going to dive into that progress and those challenges. I'll start with the scale of the work, because so much of the work when we talk about the Bay is not about the Bay itself, but about the watershed that feeds into that Bay. So all 6 states have waters that feed into the Chesapeake, covering an area of 64,000 square miles. Within those miles, we have 1,800 local governments, 18 million people, 87,000 farms, all contributing to our goals, all part of the complement that calls this watershed home. Next. So when we talk about the Chesapeake Bay as a treasure, it is a treasure because of its value to us, the people within that watershed. It is providing the basic elements of life. It is an economic generator to the Bay, to the watershed, to our region. The Bay and its people are irrevocably linked, and it is that link that makes the health of that Bay so important. Next. So that's what brings me here today, the health of that treasure. The Bay and many of its tributaries are classified as impaired under the Clean Water Act. And that means that the amount of pollution entering the water is Entering that affected waterway is preventing that water from meeting water quality standards that are set to protect human health and living resources. There are many types of impairment, but for the Bay, we are particularly concerned about nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment, contributing to poor water clarity and low dissolved oxygen. Why are we particularly worried about clarity and oxygen? For as vast as the Bay can seem when you're crossing that Bay Bridge, it is actually quite shallow. 75% of the Chesapeake is less than 10 feet deep. That shallowness contributes to its productivity. It allows sunlight to penetrate the bottom that supports underwater habitats and living resources. But that shallowness also contributes to a challenge. It is a relatively small amount of water to accept all of that pollution from that landscape. That runoff, overloaded with nutrients, feeds algae blooms. Those algae blooms cloud the water, they deplete oxygen, and they create dead zones, areas where oxygen levels are too low for our living resources to survive. Next. That is in essence how we set our goals for the Chesapeake Bay, not simply for the sake of clean water, but for the health of all of the living resources that rely on that clean water and those habitats, and for the people that rely on those living resources. Our goals are grounded in science. Science tells us what these resources need in terms of sunlight and oxygen to survive. It tells us what levels of nutrient pollution our waterways can handle while still maintaining that sunlight and oxygen. It helps us understand what those where those excess pollutants are coming from, and then it helps us determine what actions we can take to reduce that pollution before it reaches our waterways. So, having traced our work from the people to the living resources to the pollutants that put those resources at risk, we come to the Chesapeake Bay total maximum daily load. The TMDL is the Bay's pollution diet, the maximum amount of nutrient and sediment pollution that the Bay can handle while still providing healthy conditions for our living resources. We are not trying to eliminate all nutrients and sediment to the Bay. We are trying to get it down to a level that does not negatively impact those resources. The sources of that pollution are diverse, but we break them down into a few major categories. For example, here, we're just looking at nitrogen pollution. Agriculture is the largest source of nitrogen load to the Chesapeake Bay at 45%, followed by wastewater and stormwater. This doesn't mean that agriculture is the bad guy in this situation. Behind forests, agriculture is the second biggest land use in the region, and we know that farming is inherently a leaky business when it comes to nutrients. Ideally, all of the nutrients from fertilizer and manure would be taken up and come through in higher yields from plant production, but that's not always the case. We also know that our farming operations are trying to produce more on fewer acres to keep feeding our communities and keep turning a profit. But still, since agriculture is the largest source of nitrogen pollution and is the second largest land use, all eyes are on agriculture right now as a place for opportunity when we're looking for our plans for the future. If you look at the jurisdiction's watershed implementation plans on how we're going to reduce pollution, nearly 90% of the remaining reductions are set to come from agricultural lands. So how are we doing so far? Well, we're making progress. The green arrows show that we are headed in the right direction when you look at the modeled pollution load reductions. That is thanks to many of the actions that you and your colleagues in the other Bay jurisdictions are taking now and over the past few decades. Most of that progress can be attributed to two key changes: wastewater technology upgrades and air emission standards. It's not all good news, though. While those arrows are headed in the right direction, they're not headed there fast enough. We are not on pace to have the practices in place to meet our nutrient load reductions on time, according to the Bay model. As of 2022, the partnership, all of the states, have best management practices in place to achieve 51% of nitrogen reductions. Maryland is a little further along at 60%. We won't hit 100 by 2025. So we have an implementation gap. Not enough actions or practices in place to meet our goals in the Bay model. The implementation gap, however, isn't the only thing keeping us from our goals. Last year, the Chesapeake Bay's Science and Technical Advisory Committee, often called STAC, completed a multi-year effort to look at why progress towards meeting our Bay TMDL and our water quality goals has been slower than expected. That resulting report is called a Comprehensive Evaluation of System Response, or CESR for short. And it kind of looked at the problem as visualized in this chart. We have seen the population in our region increase, the development increase, the number, the agriculture activity intensify, and we've still managed to reduce our pollutant loads, which is great. But what we aren't seeing is a corresponding response in meeting our water quality standards that we might have expected. Those blue bars at the bottom show attainment of those water quality standards over time. Now, some of those dips that you're seeing correspond with wetter periods where more rain is pushing more pollution off of our landscapes. But when you take water flow into account, the trajectory of that little orange line that you might just see floating in those blue bars, it's positive, but it is slow. It is very, very slow. And we are miles away from that blue line at the top of 100% in our attainment of our water quality standards. So why is that? Well, the CSER report can be boiled down to two findings. First, closing the implementation gap and achieving our pollutant load reductions. That will take getting more out of our agriculture and stormwater programs. The programs in their current form cannot close that implementation gap on their own. We are going to need to innovate to make them more effective moving forward. Second, closing the water quality response gap, or that effort to see more attainment of our water quality standards. We need to consider what drives us in order to better focus our efforts over time. Focusing our efforts, our attention, our measurement of progress on achieving all water quality standards everywhere, including the deepest parts of the bay, is valuable in the long run, but it's going to take us a long time. If what drives us is protecting and supporting the bay's living resources, we can potentially refocus and prioritize our work in the interim as we get there and see really important benefits from our work between now and then that are worth getting in the interim. Next slide. So some of the potential innovations and opportunities when it comes to closing the implementation gap. We can target programs and investments to hotspots, places where we know that large pollution or suspect that large pollution loads are coming from because the nutrients entering that landscape are greater than the nutrients leaving that landscape in terms of production. We can also use incentive programs that pay based on outcome rather than based on implementation, just putting that practice in place. Paying based on outcome can encourage people to try more effective practices, to put them in more effective places, and to look at different types of financing so that money can go farther. Next. And then opportunities to refocus our water quality efforts. We're looking for areas and efforts where we can see more living resource response in the interim. Generally, these are going to be shallow and open water areas where you want to see underwater grasses, crabs, oysters. These are places where the life cycles of fish are most often impacted. When we're thinking about how to invest and what practices to use, we can consider projects that are going to deliver more than just water quality benefits, but habitat benefits in these particular areas. We can see those habitats improve. We can see those living resources respond before our streams fully meet their water quality standards. So to be clear, we're still working on meeting those water quality standards, but maybe we can see some other responses a little bit sooner. And as I started this presentation, it's the living resource response that we're all looking for in this endeavor. That is what is driving us. This is particularly important for Maryland because there is so much connection in this state between the state and the shallow waters and open waters. And these findings have the potential to have great impact on the health of the living resources in those areas. So I think that's pretty remarkable and exciting. I have one more minute, so I'm gonna do this slide. So depending with these challenges in mind and the corresponding opportunities, this is directing the Commission's focus. Now through 2025, we are committed to making progress, as much progress as possible on the plans we already have in place. Keep pushing on the things that we've already designed because they do make a difference. So that's our focus from now to 2025. Even as we do that, we are planning for beyond 2025. What comes after? What innovations can we start to fold into our work so that we can get farther, faster in the future? The whole watershed approach, which you'll hear more about in a second, that is part of looking for those innovations and trying to pull them into the fold of our work as early as possible. We're also maintaining our focus on federal priorities because we know how important federal appropriations, federal policy are in pushing us further. So things like the Farm Bill, the appropriations process, we are all engaged on trying to make sure that those are working for the Chesapeake Bay. And with that, I look forward to taking your questions at the appropriate time, but thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. We will get swapped over here, but good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee. My name is Allison Colden. I'm the Maryland Executive Director for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and happy to be joined today by Matt Stegman, our Maryland staff attorney. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation, we are happy to build upon the Bay Commission's presentation. As Anna mentioned, we have a long ways to go in reaching 2025, but we also want to highlight that there's no need to wait, and there's very specific and welcome opportunities for the legislature to engage in 2024 and beyond to make progress towards our Bay restoration goals. So to introduce you all to the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, we are the largest conservation organization, regional conservation organization dedicated to saving the Chesapeake Bay. We operate across Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, and the photo you see here is our headquarters office located in Annapolis, Maryland. We have more than 200 employees, and we work across all 3 states in our flagship programs. First, we work on the ground restoration, particularly related to working with farmers to implement best management practices, planting oysters across the watershed, as well as planting trees, riparian buffers, grasses, and other things to help reduce nutrient pollution before it reaches the bay. Last year, we also celebrated 50 years of our environmental education program, which reaches out to thousands of Maryland students, teachers, and administrators on an annual basis. We have more than 20 different educational programs, including residential education centers in both Maryland and Virginia on several of the island centers where we are happy to host students and teachers every year and give them an amazing firsthand experience in learning what an incredible treasure and resource the Chesapeake Bay is. We also, as you are well aware, are engaged in advocacy and spend a lot of time here with you all in this room during the legislative session, another core function of our organization. So to build upon the Caesar report, as it's affectionately known, the findings and recommendations that were highlighted previously are that we have several critical gaps in our non-point source pollution. I want to point out that we've made a tremendous amount of progress in our point source pollution in making investments in wastewater treatment plant upgrades, in enforcement of discharge permits for point source polluters. And a lot of Maryland's progress to date can be attributed to those investments that have been made by the state. However, the non-point source pollution problem is obviously a lot more complicated and diffuse. And one of the main recommendations and findings of that Caesar report to reemphasize are some systemic problems in the incentive structures that have been developed over time to address non-point source pollution, particularly in the agricultural and stormwater sectors. First is the lack of targeting. Because these are voluntary incentive programs, they're driven more by the desires and the goals and the voluntary nature of those programs and the landowners who wish to participate in them, rather than necessarily where those best management practices would be most effective. There's also this issue of mass imbalance, which refers to a concept where we need nutrients is not necessarily where nutrients are being produced. We have several areas, for example, on Maryland's eastern shore, which have a tremendous amount of legacy nutrients in the soil, except that's where a lot of those nutrients continue to be produced and applied. And so thinking about where these nutrients are going in a whole watershed concept is extremely important to ensuring that we are balancing where these nutrients end up on the landscape. Innovation. So we understand that, administering some of these incentive programs requires a particular framework, a regulatory framework, scoring in some cases as to how different opportunities are doled out. But in some cases, that means that it has been a little bit too static and a little bit too rigid, meaning we've lacked innovation in some places where a different approach could likely lead to a more cost-effective outcome. And lastly, performance-based incentives. Right now, a lot of the modeling which you have seen coming out of the Chesapeake Bay program is based on implementation rather than the outcomes of that implementation. So we are accounting for practices and tracking practices, and in many cases attributing a default value for nutrient and sediment reduction associated with that practice, rather than measuring the outcomes of those practices on the ground. We know that sometimes we see that those practices are less effective, or if they lack maintenance or are not functioning properly, are being attributed greater nutrient and sediment reductions than we're actually seeing in the field. Next. So there are several areas where the Chesapeake Bay Foundation sees opportunities to make progress, even as we work with the Chesapeake Bay Program Partnership on defining the future for bay restoration. The first is connecting people to the resource, making sure that they are invested in bay restoration, requiring accountability, implementing cost-effective solutions, and building in the impacts of climate change and rectifying environmental injustices. So we have several legislative solutions which we believe will become before this committee for you all to consider this year. First, which you've already heard about, is the Whole Watershed Act, which is we've worked on with Delegate Love and Senator Sarah Elfreth. And one of the things that we have noticed over time, and many have noticed over time, is what we're calling random acts of restoration. This approach leads to large investments of state and federal dollars, and oftentimes without those big results. So some solutions that this legislation would provide is that it would prioritize state funding for 5 comprehensive watershed restoration projects, and also require a certification and licensure for developers and contractors who carry out restoration projects to ensure quality of those projects. This builds upon those principles that we're trying to improve through creating targeting. This would specifically fund 5 watershed projects which range across geographic land use and require a nod towards environmental justice as well. Next. Closing the industrial sludge loophole. I hope you all have finished your lunches for this one, but this is another piece of legislation that we're happy to partner with Delegate Love on. And industrial sludge is a growing issue in Maryland. And the reason for that is that relative to some of our neighboring states like Virginia and Delaware, Maryland's regulations of industrial sludge, particularly DAF, which stands for dissolved air flotation material, is much more lax than those neighboring states. And therefore, we have seen increase in import of that material into Maryland where it is applied on our farmlands. Oftentimes, because of just annual testing, farmers may not know what is made up in this sludge and may not know the best practices for its use. We've also seen that there are some particular bad actors in this space which are acknowledged by other farmers who would like to see a way for this to be addressed more systematically. And again, building upon the principles of making sure the nutrients are balanced in where they end up in the watershed, as well as ensuring additional accountability. Lastly, Living Shorelines, House Bill 655, Senate Bill 546 by Delegate Stein. Shoreline hardening is something that continues in Maryland despite the legislature passing a law in 2008 to require the use of living shorelines as the default in Maryland. However, we know that there are waivers that continue to be granted for folks who continue to harden their shorelines, which is a concern not only because it increases the amount of nutrients that are reaching the bay, but also because it has significant threshold impacts on important species like blue crabs and menhaden. This bill would clarify that existing waiver review process to ensure that living shorelines are considered at every point when a project is being proposed, as well as providing additional funding opportunities to help increase their adoption and educate practitioners and landowners about the benefits of living shorelines and resources available to them, with the purpose of maximizing co-benefits, again, for living resources and our focus on shallow water habitats. So lastly, the progress that we've made so far, although slow, has been significant. But we do want to point out, given the budget challenges we know that the General Assembly will have to address this year and in coming years, just wanted to point out that that progress is fragile and we cannot afford to backtrack on those key investments. Some recent events, particularly around wastewater treatment plant compliance and other issues, show that those investments need to continue to be made and followed up on if we are going to protect the progress made in those other sectors to date. And lastly, finishing up, scientifically informed approaches that focus on outcomes and co-benefits can help us achieve our multiple goals related to climate equity and eventually bay restoration. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all very much for your presentations and your commitment to the Bay. And Matt, good to see you.
You as well, Mr. Chair.
Delegate Ruth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This was a great, both of these were great presentations. There's a lot to unpack here, trying to understand all the implications of everything. I want to refer to one of the slides in the Chesapeake Bay Commission report where it says, don't allow water quality investments to leave living resource benefits on the table. Can you explain that a little better?
I think, so that slide is courtesy of the editors of the Caesar report. And I think the point that they're trying to make there is that when we are looking at the full selection of BMPs that one can, conservation practices that we can use, there are some that can deliver both water quality benefits and habitat benefits. So like a forest buffer, for example, it not only helps clean the water as it comes down our landscape, but it's also providing habitat along that stream. It's cooling the water, which is good for certain types of fish. So when we're looking at making choices on how to invest that money, if you're looking at two options where one can deliver multiple benefits at once, don't leave that on the table. Really make sure that we're thinking about those benefits in that selection process, but being mindful that both are important.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much. That's very helpful. May I follow up, Mr. Chair? Thank you. So it's no secret that Delegates Terrasso, Lehman, and I are working on some guardrails on stream restoration. And one of the things that we've been told is that for these projects, water quality is the only thing that, for the MS4 projects particularly, that only water quality can be considered in the crediting system. Do you think that's true? And if so, how do we make sure that the habitat benefits are also considered when these projects are done?
I'm probably not able to speak to the first one, but I would say for this, to your point that we should be considering all of these benefits, that I think is the task before us right now as an entire program, is to be mindful of all of those benefits at the same time.
Okay, thank you so much.
Delegate Lehman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also have a question or two about the comprehensive restoration, watershed restoration project legislation. I know we will be discussing the bill in this committee, but I want to understand the perspective of how, if the bill actually identifies those 5 areas, or that will be done later, and what will be the criteria?
So for the record, Matt Stegman, Chesapeake Bay Foundation. Again, I know we'll have a bill hearing, and I don't want to, speak about a bill that's not before the committee yet. But I think the bill will describe the types of watersheds. It will not identify specific watersheds. Part of the approach, the comprehensive approach that the bill will call for requires a great degree of community and local government cooperation. So part of the watersheds that participate in the program, it'll be kind of where where there's energy and buy-in from the folks who live within that watershed.
Good to hear. And I certainly will be talking to Delegate Love further about this, but so you just addressed my second question in part, which was question/comment that maybe I should say, do you agree that a lot more community engagement can and should be done on these projects going forward, any kind of watershed restoration projects? Based on the projects we've seen, and we've walked several of these, there has not been good, I'm talking regular stream restoration, not good if any communication engagement at all, which is really unacceptable.
I would say in general, the greater communication and community engagement you can have on any watershed restoration, BMP, stream restoration, or beyond is going to be critical, especially as we move forward in addressing non-point source pollution, because it's going to require the cooperation of a tremendous number of private landowners, public landowners, in order to really address the volume and the quality of water that's reaching those streams as well. So the more engagement that we can do, I think will be better in bringing folks on board and understanding that the role that they play in helping to protect their home watersheds and home waters.
Great, thank you. That's good to hear. I think it has to be an essential part of this, any legislative proposal addressing restoration. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Delegate Healy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the presentation and thank you, Mr. Chair, for recognizing me. I wanted to ask you about the various states. And we get this presentation every year, and Maryland has always been doing a lot more than our neighbor directly to the north in Pennsylvania, as far as pollution going into the Susquehanna River, which flows into the Chesapeake Bay, across the Conowingo Dam, which is now filled with silt and other debris. What's going on in Pennsylvania? Are they making any progress at all? You were very careful not to, pinpoint one state or another, but we have to live with decisions that are made elsewhere, and we can't fix it all by ourselves.
So I think I'll say each of our states, from the commission's perspective, is dealing with different challenges and different opportunities when it comes to tackling their portions of the Chesapeake Bay restoration effort. From Pennsylvania's perspective, so much of the effort has to come from agriculture, and we know across the watershed, agriculture is such a difficult one to tackle because it involves a lot of voluntary effort, and Pennsylvania just faces that head on. We were really excited about them creating the Agriculture Conservation Assistance Program, ACAP, 2 years ago, because that means now all 3 states have a program in place to help farmers help pay for those conservation practices. They funded that program with $154 million, and I think they have authorized all of that money. They're still working through getting those projects in place and implemented, but they've got plans for spending all of those dollars, and our members in Pennsylvania are already thinking about how do you put more money into that program so that it continues to grow. So I think Pennsylvania is all in. They are taking it seriously, but they have a challenge in that so much of their work needs to happen on agricultural landscapes and haven't had the same opportunities to use the wastewater sector as some of the other jurisdictions have had.
Thank you.
Delegate Jacobs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I got a question for all of you sitting up there, especially my friends Allison and Anna. Guys, we have this presentation every year, State of the Bay, and typically, if you really want to give a barometer of the Bay, you'd include oysters in your presentation. Now this year, we've had I believe arguably the 3rd highest natural spat set in the history of Maryland, which you all should be standing up cheering and shooting some rockets off and things of that nature, because that's a feat that is certainly something we all want to see achieved, and that was the case this year, isn't that so? Mm-hmm. So how come you didn't mention the oyster restoration, or what's happened this year and a natural spat set in the Chesapeake Bay, the entire Chesapeake Bay.
You wanna take it?
I think just for time, knowing how much we wanted to be able to share with you and kind of flesh out a full story, it didn't make it in, but that's not to indicate that that's not an important fact for everyone to know about.
Well, I mean, if you're getting into the state of the bay, we talk about oysters every year. It's not something that's not talked about. It's a serious issue that this committee has dealt with every single year. And certainly I would think that we should, if we have this sort of results, that this committee should get that report from, especially you guys. If you really want to be comprehensive about the state of the bay, we should be talking about, you know, the real success of the oyster business. Wouldn't you agree with that?
You know, it's one of my favorite topics, Delegate. I loved chatting oysters with you, and do acknowledge that it was an incredible year, not only in the volume of the spat set, but the geographic distribution of it. Heading squarely into 2025, we did want to take this opportunity, as also with the Caesar report, to highlight that seminal report and all the information that it summarized over the past 40 years of bay restoration. But always happy to chat oysters and to raise a glass with you to this year's success. So thank you for bringing that forward.
I thank you, but would it be possible, maybe this could be DNR that could provide us that, you know, there is a document that shows the areas in red on the map where the spat set was successful and areas where it really wasn't as successful. Could that be provided to the committee, either by DNR or by you? I think everybody should see that.
I won't speak for DNR, but I'm sure they'd be happy to.
Thank you very much.
Delegate Jacobs, Delegate Teresa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for this wonderful presentation. I don't know without pulling it up whether you can answer this question, but I'm looking at the Chesapeake Bay Commission slides, and on page 9, there's pictures. Am I looking in the right place? Hold on a second. Sorry, I might be on the wrong one. Yeah, it's the Chesapeake Bay Commission's report. And there's like pictures, it says major sources, 45% for agriculture, 16%, I guess, is road runoff. I'm just trying to understand what 18% was in the bottom. It's like this pretty picture of trees and mountains, and I'm wondering what that was in reference to.
That is going to be your forested lands, your natural landscapes. Those are also going to be contributing nutrients downstream. So they're also taken into consideration.
Okay. And then in slide, I guess it's slide on page 10, you're talking about modeled nitrogen loads and modeled phosphorus loads. And I'm wondering if you could speak to what that means, what you mean by modeled, and whether are these actual measurements or these are coming from a certain amount of work done being and what the model says that should produce?
Very much the latter. So these are based on the practices we know have been put in place, accepted, put into a model, and then the results of those practices according to the model and what they're able to reduce or what's being reported here. And that's why there's a gap when it comes to the practices in place and what we assume they're able to deliver, but then a different gap in what we're actually seeing when it comes to monitoring about how the waterways are doing.
So then, and I'm sorry to keep referring to pages, but this is how I have my notes here. So on page 11, you're showing a comprehensive evaluation of the Caesar report, and you have nitrogen down 30%, phosphorus 48%, sediment 11%. Are those actual numbers, or those are also model numbers?
I would have to check with the editors of the report who gave us this. I would assume they're talking about modeled there,
Okay.
and they've layered that on top of a graph that's looking at monitored.
And what are we doing, or what are they doing? What are you doing? What are we doing to do actual measurements of those things?
There is there's an extensive monitoring network to look at stream health, water quality throughout the Bay region. If you want specifics on how that monitoring network works, I'll have to get back to you on that because I'm not.
And
the
yeah,
best-
I'd appreciate that. And part of what I'm getting at is how closely are the actual numbers to the monitoring, if that makes, to the model numbers.
You've hit on a pretty important question that the Bay program grapples with daily
Okay.
on understanding that. The model has been being adjusted over time to try to get closer and closer, but there's always going to be a difference between the two because it's a model.
And is that a big gap, a small gap? Like, how are we doing in terms of modeling versus the real numbers?
I don't know how, I'll get back to you on.
Okay,
the-
thank
the
you.
right way to characterize it. Yeah.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Well, one thing I wanted to add too is that these are complex ecological systems. And so one of the other factors that they believe is contributing to the gap in the response is the time lag that it takes for the system to respond to that activity. So you may put in a practice like planting trees or a buffer. Often when we plant trees, they're quite small, and the impact that they're going to have in terms of improving water quality at that stream may take several years to actually manifest. And so those practices are put into the model at the time of implementation. And so what we're seeing may also include not only a gap in the actual response, but there may also be a time lag or a temporal gap, which means we wouldn't see the actual benefits for several years down the road, even though they've already been incorporated in the model.
I appreciate that. And theoretically, you could match up those sort of, if there's that time lag, you could match that up to where it is actually taking effect. And hopefully those numbers would match closer. But thank you so much.
Delegate Naraki.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I represent a Bay district in Eastern Baltimore County, and we addressed it a little bit in the presentation, but I wanted to kind of go a little bit further and have a discussion about wastewater treatment plants. So, my part of Baltimore County has been significantly and continues to be impacted by the Back River wastewater treatment plant. Just wanted to get your thoughts on where that plant is. I know we've had some significant issues, over the past few years. We of course had a big legal victory recently with respect to that plant. Wanted to get your thoughts on where it is and what the Bay Foundation is going to do going forward to continue holding that plant accountable to make sure that we don't kind of slip back, and what we can do to improve in the future, because it is certainly not a completely resolved issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that touches on a point. Thank you for the opportunity to reiterate that, is that a lot of our Bay restoration funds and state funds so far have gone to improving those wastewater treatment plants. And a lot of our progress so far has been made in that sector. However, if we do continue to see maintenance issues, compliance issues, breakdowns in equipment, that is causing those overflows and significant impacts to local waterways as well as the Bay. So it's not just a one and done. The progress that we made has to be maintained over time, as well as increasing the pace and acceleration of new programs and progress. As the Bay Foundation, we do serve in a quote, kind of watchdog role. We keep an eye on permitted facilities and permitted dischargers to ensure that they are within their compliance. We've also been supporting and encouraging the Department of the Environment to fully execute their enforcement and compliance duties and responsibilities. And hopefully that will continue to improve the conditions that we've seen at Backwater and Patapsco.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yep.
So no member of the Bay Commission, Delegate Stein.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the Commission and Foundation staff for your presentations. I think, Allison, you noted that the CESAR report said that restoration efforts in the shallow waters, rivers, and streams could be the most effective approach moving forward. And is there a strategy about how to implement that concept, or is the whole watershed approach part of that?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Delegate. I think both. So shallow waters and the emphasis on shallow waters, I want to reiterate something that Anna said. It is in no way implying from our presentation anyway, or we think in the CESAR report, that our focus on improving water quality in the Bay's deepest channel should not continue to be a goal. However, it's recognizing that that is the most difficult area and longest term area that we would have in order to see the needle really move there in terms of improvements for water quality and living resources. So the reference to shallow waters, living resources, and open waters in that report is really talking about places where we can make significant progress in the short term. So working in, headwater streams, in shallow areas along our shorelines, shallow subtidal areas in our creeks and rivers, improving the water quality in those areas can be a way to most quickly improve water quality in a way that benefits living resources and the communities that surround those watersheds. So the whole Watershed Act is an attempt to do that, and focusing in those watersheds, those headwater streams down to the tidal rivers and creeks. And so it's going to be a pilot in a way to try and implement directly those lessons that are put forward in recommendations from the CESA report.
Great, thank you.
Delegate Morgan.
Chair, thank you guys for your report. I have a district that represents the Bay, the Patuxent, and the Potomac, and you mentioned the living shoreline. Estimates are for a living shoreline, it's about $500 to $600 a foot to put them in. And while I understand the concept behind it, is an expensive proposition. And B, once a good storm comes up, any of those waterways, they have a tendency to wipe them right out. So I'm looking sort of where the middle ground here is, where you want to put the living shoreline in, the homeowner has to find a way to come up with that kind of money per foot. And then all of a sudden, the storm comes in and says, thank you very much, and you can't control Mother Nature.
Yeah, thank you, Delegate Morgan. I think, you may recall that the committee had a living shorelines bill brought forward by CBF last session. I know we'll have a bill hearing on this in the future, so I'll be very brief, but I think the bill that the committee is going to see this year is not going to really in any kind of substantive way change the criteria or operation of the existing living shoreline law and waiver process. And it will, I think, to your point, create some additional financial opportunities to deal with that cost gap. And happy to follow up with you offline about some of the other things that we've been doing separately with MDE and the Chesapeake Bay Trust and some other partners.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Vice Chair Boyce, last question for this briefing.
Thank you so much for your presentation, for being here. I'm always complexed by these reports, because on one hand, we say Maryland is doing well and doing better than other places, and then yet I hear we're not doing enough. And you mentioned earlier about needing, for instance, ag. You talked a lot about ag and not the other major sources. I would have loved to hear more about the other major sources, but that there needs to be cooperation, and there's nothing but essentially volunteer effort. And I'm just wondering, at some point, when is there a partnership between ag and essentially an organization like yourself? Because to have to change practices all the time, I think, can be incredibly hard. And I don't think there isn't anyone who doesn't want to do the right thing and help do their part. But I never hear partnership. I hear cooperation. I hear what they're not doing enough of, but I don't hear partnership. Is there a reason?
I can weigh in on that.
You can start and I'll.
Okay, sure. I would, even though we didn't use the word, I would absolutely characterize it as partnership. For example, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation works directly with farmers to help them implement best management practices on their properties and help them to access things like state and federal cost share funding to make it financially available to them, as well as technical assistance in helping them access and apply to those programs. So I very much think that it is a partnership. And when we talk about practices, the practices themselves in many ways don't necessarily need to change. We recognize that not every practice is appropriate in every place. There is a good practice and a good place for everything, for those combinations of those two. And so it becomes important that we are making sure state programs are incentivizing the most cost-effective as well as the most effective practices for water quality. And I think that's what the main finding of the Caesar report is the way some of our agricultural cost share programs are currently structured. Just financially, the way that they are structured is they provide incentives for things that may not be the most cost effective or cost effective over time, meaning they have to be annual practices versus permanent practices that just take, one year of investment. And so that's what we are really encouraging the Department of Ag to evaluate as they move forward. If the way those programs are structured are incentivizing the most effective practices in the most effective places. And that weighs in on a farmer's decision making and on his bottom line. It may not necessarily be that the farmer is doing something that is not as effective. It has to do with the way that the programs are structured, which pushes people's decision making in one way or the other.
And at what point do you believe that certain programs that aren't working should be phased out and other programs should be considered?
Well, I hope that's going to be part of a comprehensive sort of overview and look as we move into the post 2025 era, taking a close look at those programs. Maybe not necessarily phased out, reformed, maybe some of them phased out to make space for new ones that we think are more innovative and effective at achieving those nutrient reductions. But being open to looking at how these things are functioning, I think is going to be critical to improving our results moving forward.
And if I can add a couple things from the commission
Yes,
perspective. So we've spent this whole past year looking at our agriculture communities to understand the challenges and needs that they have because of this idea of partnership, with the idea that sustainable farms are both economically viable and environmentally sustainable. So in order for a farmer to choose to adopt practices, they need to know that they can make their bottom line before they take on additional conservation responsibilities. So we've looked at that. We've also looked at innovative partnerships. So how are we bringing more people into partnership with the agriculture community, whether that's other parts of the food supply chain or other private entities that want to help with financing these programs. And then as a Bay program, we're looking at adding an advisory committee from the agricultural community to be part of that partnership, part of the complement of people advising the Bay program, the executive council, on how to better partner with farmers. So I think that is a major theme of the conversations happening right now.
Thank you.
Vice Chair Boyce, I believe that concludes this briefing. So colleagues, thank you all again. We'll transition to an update from the Maryland Department of Natural Resources on striped bass, blue catfish, and I'm guessing we're going to add oysters to that perhaps. Thank you for being here, Mr. Secretary.
All right. Good afternoon, Chair Kerman, Vice Chair Boyce, and members of the committee. I'm Josh Kurtz, Secretary of the Department of Natural Resources. For the record, my colleague, our Assistant Secretary for Aquatic Resources, Kristen Fiddler, is joining me for this conversation. I am more than happy to add oysters if you would like, Delegate Jacobs, a little bit higher level, but we can provide that information, the spat set that the delegate was referring to. While this is coming up, can I make a quick comment on Delegate Boyce's last question? I think one of the important things about partnership sometimes is formalization of partnerships. And when we look at the decision-making structures that are in place around bay restoration, we recognize that there wasn't a seat at the table necessarily formally for the agriculture community. They are represented by our agriculture departments at the states who do a fantastic job, but we wanted to hear more directly from them. So we currently serve as the chair of the Principal Staff Committee, which supports the Executive Council the governor is the chair of. And this year we are actually kicking off and creating the first ever Ag Advisory Committee. So that will be, it's being put together by an action team right now. We'll know what it'll look like in June, but the focus of that is bringing actual on the ground farmers into an advisory committee to talk to decision makers as we put together this next piece. So I just wanted to put just a little comment on the formalization of partnership. So thank you for letting me do that. All right, so shifting gears. We're here today to talk about two species. One is the most iconic, the striped bass, and I think one has achieved the status of most infamous, and that is the blue catfish. The most important thing you will see in my presentation today is this slide. We need to protect striped bass, and we need to significantly deplete the blue catfish. So I'm just going to start with striped bass and give you a little bit of background, because I think this is important for how we manage. The striped bass is a large, long-lived species that migrates. It goes up and down the coast, but it predominantly starts, about 70% of all striped bass are born in Maryland. They're born in the Chesapeake Bay. We have a resident set of striped bass, and we also then have the migratory species that come in from the Atlantic Ocean, and they spawn here within the Chesapeake Bay. The next one. And so there's a couple really important pieces to their life cycle that I wanted to highlight because some of these things are changing quickly and drastically. The first is water temperature. So water temperature actually triggers them to spawn and to reproduce. And what we're seeing now is actually shifts in what our water temperature looks like. That water temperature doesn't just trigger the striped bass to spawn, it also impacts the food source for the babies, the zooplankton. I'm always excited to talk plankton in rooms like these, but that is the initial food source for the young striped bass. So when they emerge, when they are born, that's the first thing they eat. Water temperature could create and has started to create a disconnect between food source and the young striped bass. So when we think about our goals and really the challenges, the goals right now are conservation and increase recruitment. And so for conservation, what we're looking to do is really rebuild this stock. You know, we want to see, and we have a goal under the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. We're going to talk about that in a minute. That adds a layer of complexity to management because it's not just Maryland making these decisions. This is made through a voting process for all of the East Coast states. And then recruitment. So recruitment really means how many young are we getting and what is the spawning capacity of these females? So what we're seeing is two things, high mortality, higher than what we expected to be able to rebuild the stock. In 2020, before 2022, we had a very high likelihood, 97.5% to get to our goals by 2029. That's now down to 15%. And that is largely driven by a lack of babies. So the juvenile abundance or the JI. This is the 5th year in a row where we've had some historically bad reproductive success for our striped bass. I will say, being an optimist, the snow that we've had is a good thing. What we need for striped bass is colder winters, colder water. The water stays colder longer, slow releases of that cold water from the snow. So I'm rooting for lots of snow, not just because I like to get outside in the snow, but because we need it for striped bass and for oysters actually as well. Next slide, please. So what you see on this slide, and this is really where some of the challenge of management comes in, is this is the mortality on the coast. So this is total mortality of striped bass. And what you'll see is the recreational release mortality and recreational harvest on the coast is really the driver of mortality and removals of striped bass. Next slide, please. And then what you're going to see here is the Chesapeake Bay removals and mortality. And so in the Bay, commercial harvest does increase in terms of the overall percentage. That's because most of the states on the coast do not have commercial industries that are supported by striped bass. One thing I want to point out here is if you look on the right where we are, our removals and mortality have gone down, but our population has not rebounded. And that is a significant cause for concern from a species manager. And it also points to a really difficult challenge we have because our traditional tools are reducing the amount of fish that can be removed from the system. That's how we rebuild stock. That has happened, and we are still not seeing that rebound, which is going to require new science and new ways of approaching this. Next slide. So we talked about the young of the year. This just shows you how very poor we're doing. What you also can see is we have had really poor juvenile age indexes in the past and have seen rebounds. And a large part of this is because of the life cycle of the fish. They are very long-lived. They reproduce year in and year out. And so a couple big age classes, big spikes on that graph can really carry us for a long period of time. So what do we do to manage this species? And I talked about, it's all about controlling removals right now. That's what we have control over. So we look at slot limit, which is the size of the fish that can be harvested, total number of fish, the season, and quota limits. And that's kind of sector specific. And then how does this all kind of work together? So we have the Coastal Federal State Partnership. That's the Atlantic Strait Marine Fisheries Commission, which is an incredibly well-timed hearing because we just had the ruling on that, or the vote on that, this past week. And then we also, Maryland takes into a consideration and creates regulations around to align with SMFC. And then if we are looking to be more conservative, we can go above and beyond what they recommend. And we lead with science. So the striped bass, we are really the epicenter for species study on the coast, whether that be striped bass, oysters, or crabs. We have a juvenile age abundance index, a spring gill net survey. I mean, a wide range of things that we're looking at. This year, we're also going to have our stock assessment, which is a huge compilation of science that's going to give us a better picture of what's going on with the species. So some growing concerns are really about this mortality and how it's not then aligning with abundance kind of rebound. The next several slides, we're going to give you a lot of data on where we are and what the regulations we have in place in Maryland are. I'll kind of move through these quickly. We wanted you to be able to read through these. We can have a deeper discussion, but I want to also get to blue catfish too. So we have what Maryland proposed. So these are our emergency regulations that are going to be heard at AELR this Friday, and then the ASMFC measures, which were voted on this past week, which we are required to implement by May 1st through regulation. So what you're seeing here is our Maryland only. So before, think about when they reproduce, we want to protect the spawning population. So we want to reduce harvest. We want to reduce catch and release in the month of April, because that's really when they spawn. A little bit of trickle over into May. And now we're starting to see some questions. Has that spawning actually started to happen in March, right? So we have to answer that question too, to make sure that we're putting closures in place that protect the species. So what we look to do through our emergency regulations is to extend that April closure into the first 2 weeks of May. And then also extend it in the Susquehanna Flats, because that's the northernmost section where they reproduce in the bay. So slightly different time windows. Excellent. All right. These are a lot of details about what happened at ASMFC, but I just want you to see that what happened basically is the slot limits came down. And that means that we no longer have a trophy season, which is a very popular recreation, catching big fish, your trophy fish. We no longer are going to have that because of these ASMFC regulations. The commission also voted to reduce our commercial quota by 7%, which we actually have to implement this year. And as well, we used to allow our charter boat captains to have 2 fish per client. They took that ability away from us, so now they're only allowed to have 1 fish. All right, so that is the regulatory landscape on striped bass. So I'll turn to blue catfish. So one thing that I think is important to kind of note here is how prevalent the commercial landings, or how large the commercial landings of blue catfish already are. And I wanted to start with this because I think what it shows is just the incredible potential that this species has economically for the state of Maryland, but also how a cooperative approach with our watermen is going to be critical for us to be able to tackle the blue catfish issue. So a little bit, so this kind of shows you some of the commercial landings. We've seen a massive increase, right? Almost a 10-fold increase in commercial landings in blue catfish in the past decade. But one of the challenges we then have is they're so readily abundant, but there's no market on that back end, or the size of the market does not exist. And there's a lot of reasons for that, which we'll discuss. But one is a public perception issue, and one is the USDA and I know you all have heard about this, the inspection requirements related to that, that we're working to tackle. So just a little bit on how we're approaching this. So we've done something we've never done before. And that is actually create an invasive species program focused on blue catfish. It has dedicated staff, dedicated resources to a plan to deplete the species. We're a part of several partnerships, whether that be federal and state, across states, and with our watermen, to make sure that we are suppressing and pushing down and building a market, right? At the end of the day, what we need is a market that demands millions and millions, 10 million, 15 million pounds of blue catfish, so we can actually put a dent in their population numbers. One thing that happened recently, which frankly made it a little bit more difficult for us to be able to manage this, is we asked for NOAA through the U.S. Department of Commerce to declare a fisheries disaster declaration, which would give us access to hundreds of millions of dollars. Unfortunately, at the same time that we put our disaster declaration in, the Alaska crab fishery collapsed. So the funding is actually going to go up to the Alaska crab fishery, not to us to help with blue catfish. But we have been working closely with the Chesapeake Bay Commission and our other partners to advocate at the federal level for $5 million to help us increase our ability to process, increase our ability to market and to sell these fish into other markets, and to offset and defer the cost of those inspectors. So other ways that we're doing this is very much in partnership. We're working closely with the Department of Agriculture and the Maryland Fish and Hunt Invasives Campaign to really get our recreational anglers out there, our commercial harvest. This species is not your traditional catfish. They eat things that make them taste good, right? Fish tastes like what they eat. And a lot of catfish are bottom feeders. They eat detritus. But these catfish are eating striped bass. They're eating blue crab, and they're delicious. And frankly, and I think that that is a benefit in order to help us continue to build and drive that market. So really, what our focus has been is creating that demand on the back end. Whether that be institutional buyers, and we have some processors who have done some pretty innovative things this year, overhauled and retrofit crab picking houses to be processing for blue catfish. The good thing about the USDA, the only benefit about the USDA label, is it does allow you to sell to the US military. It allows you to sell to institutions that buy at very large quantities. And we see the need for that in order to build that demand. We hear from watermen all the time. I have hundreds of thousands of pounds of blue catfish. I'm trying to take them to Jessup. They're turning them down. I'm trying to take them over to Whitman's Wharf. They're at capacity. And so what we need to be able to create is the buying power on that back end. So those processors are always taking those fish. So our watermen are able to bring them and have them processed.
So that's the end.
And-
About oysters.
Would you like a oyster bonus?
Yeah, I mean, if you just want to give a brief summary of.
Yes, and I think that the key piece on oysters is we are seeing the largest spat set, one of the most robust spat sets in history. And what does that mean? It means that oysters are reproducing incredibly effectively. And so what we need to do is make sure that there's more hard bottom for them to be able to attach to. And I think one of the things that's kind of interesting about what we see with the challenges of striped bass, this lack of cold, fresh water, means warm or saltier water, which is really good for oyster reproduction. So while we're seeing this have a negative impact on striped bass, we are seeing it actually drive an increase in our oyster production. Last year was a banner year for harvest. This year, the market has not quite been what it was last year, but we're still seeing a significant rebound in abundance of oysters, largely driven by that record spat set.
And you can provide the more detailed. data.
Absolutely. Mhm.
Great.
Happy
Thank
to
you.
do so.
I see Delegate Healy has a question.
And thank you very much. I wanted to focus on one of the last things you just spoke about, and that's institutional purchase of the blue catfish. What are we doing with the institutions the Maryland government has some influence on, with whether it's our prisons, universities, where there's large numbers of people that would benefit from being able to eat this?
Yeah, that's the first place that we've been working on. This work has been going on in the Blue Catfish Work Group for a couple years, and so we're building on that. And one of the things that we're looking at there is one, ensuring that we have the supply to be able to match those contracts, because in order to get them, you have to be able to certify and guarantee that you can provide. So that is top of mind for us. What state institutions can we leverage to create that demand? And I know there's
And what about the school lunch programs
Yes. Yeah. I was just going to add, pardon me. Thank you, Delegate, for the question. This is a really exciting area and a great opportunity to capitalize on, and a real focus of the working group that contains DNR, MDA, and other agencies. They're looking at partnering with the food bank. They're looking at colleges, universities, elementary, high school, schools for the school food program. So they are really casting a wide net. Logistics and procurement and all of those issues are part of that discussion. So it's not a slam dunk, just flip a switch and have it take off, but it is absolutely a priority focus. And like I said, there's a lot of excitement around it.
Thank you so much.
Delegate Jacobs.
Thank you. I'll try to keep it brief. Thank you for the presentation. I think you did a good job with the really addressing the issues. I know that the the charter boats, captains and the commercial fleet are pretty upset about recent decisions that's going to have a very pretty adverse effect on many of them, I'm sure, and affect a lot of small communities, the economics of a lot of small communities that won't see the fish, the related income from, you know, from charter fishing, et cetera. But that's something that we'll be dealing with. But I did want to mention a couple of things. I know with this Young of the Year survey, and we've done the same places and same time, since 1954. So I guess 70 years we've been testing in the same places at the same time with the same kind of net. And, you know, there's areas that have not been tested. And, you know, I think most people that I've talked with and what I believe in is a good science, you know, that we have good, complete science on whatever the fishery management may be. And so I'm going to have some legislation to deal with some of those adaptive management issues, but to really get a better picture of the science. But would you agree or not agree? The last few years, you kind of touched on this a little bit about how the climate has gotten warmer. There's no doubt that, you know, we have this first year we've had snow like 4 or 5 years, I guess, and the fish spawn basically more on temperature than they do the calendar. So would you would agree that these fish are coming up earlier? I mean, I know for the last couple of years, my own self, that these spawning females have been coming up the bay in February, really, in March. And it's been one of my concerns is, you know, how these fish were targeted in years. I said, you know, we got to let these spawning females get to the grounds and lay their eggs. Mm-hmm. But, you know, this, I mean, wouldn't you agree from the department standpoint that that's been true, that these fish have been coming earlier?
Yeah, and so there's two pieces to this. There's staging and spawning. And so staging is, to your point, when they come up in February, January, and they start coalescing, kind of condensing within the tributaries to get prepared for spawning. And the question of when they start is one that we're really interested in. We're actually this year, for the first time ever, we're going to start our gillnet survey two weeks into March. We've never done that before. It's always been April. And the reason we're doing that is we want to get a sense for those spawning fish. Historical science and has shown that April really is that big boon, and it tends to trickle into May. But because of these temperature changes, we now really need to get a better handle on, especially the end of March. Are they spawning earlier, so that we would, you know, want to take that into consideration for making our regulations. So this year, our gillnet survey, we're actually going to move up so that we can get a better sense for spawning and whether they have pre-spawn, post-spawn. That'll also give us their age class as well. So having more data earlier in the year is going to be really important to answer that question.
Well, that's good. I'm glad to hear the department's willing to do that. Because I think that these pre-spawning females is definitely coming earlier, and it'd be good to get some accurate data on that. And my next question, I'm gonna try to tie the two together. These blue cats, the proliferation is, you know, as you can see, the harvest numbers, the marketing, the processing side has become a real challenge with the USDA, and they're not willing to vary anything, so to speak. And, you know, most people I talk to that may be interested in processing just won't do it because there's too many hurdles. You know, I know of a dealer that that had, I think, 2,500 pounds. He was putting the cats in the boxes, shipping them to Jessup. They were alive. They were actually flipping out of the boxes. He ships them to Jessup. The USDA inspector turned them down, said, these don't smell right, and they condemned them. And these are kind of issues that we're running into. It's not just the USDA inspector on site, but it's the severity of what they're using for criteria in these processing plants. And a lot of people are getting out for that reason, that they're afraid that it'll affect the rest of their business in such a negative way. It's not just the inspector. If that's all it was, it wouldn't be that big a deal, but this whole thing has gotten really out of hand. And we're dealing with a crisis, in my opinion, in the Chesapeake Bay with these blue cats. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yeah, I think too, you look at, and sorry, just really quickly, in Virginia, we see tributaries where over 75% of the biomass. So
Yeah.
the amount of living things in that river are blue catfish. And we don't want to get there. We need to stop it before it
I
gets to
had
that
some
level.
videos last year were pretty clear about how thick they are. And my next question is, do you have any evidence or to indicate whether the blue cats are affecting the juveniles in their, their habitat or how they travel? I mean, is there any evidence that blue cats, because I can tell you, the Upper Bay is full of them. I mean, they're everywhere.
Yeah, so we right now are not able to quantify exactly how big of an impact they're having, but we know that they do, right? We know they do from anecdotal evidence of seeing striped bass young within the stomachs of blue catfish. They're an incredibly effective predator, blue catfish. And so we do know that they're having an impact on striped bass. Right now we're working to figure out what is that science to quantify that. This is a complicated question to answer, but one that we're driving hard on.
But and I understand, and I know it's difficult, but I mean, from a theory standpoint, if you got that many blue cats now inhabiting the spawning areas, and they are, we know that. I mean, do you believe, or I guess we hope we can get information that would provide facts that these blue cats may be changing these patterns, and that may have a bearing on why these juvenile numbers are down?
Well, and I think what we know for sure is that they're having a significant impact across the ecosystem, on multiple age classes of striped bass, on blue crabs. I mean, you name it, herring, shad, all of these species. And I think that's at the end of the day, that really drives the need to significantly deplete the stock now. And I think we need to take that action while we learn specific and quantify impacts. But we need to take swift action now, because it's almost like, okay, if we figure out in 5 years, yep, it's 38% of the young are being eaten by blue cats, but we haven't acted on blue cats, it's not going to matter. Right. So I think it's continue to push on the science, but it is take stronger action on blue catfish, because we know just broadly, right, the impacts that they're having in the ecosystem.
Okay, so I'll try to wind it down with one or two more. One, I'll make it a good one. So I understand that this fall, for the first time, we had evidence that the blue catfish were actually eating spat in the lower bay, which we never thought was happening prior to this fall. I guess there was no evidence of it. I heard that you went down there and actually witnessed it yourself, but I don't know if that's true or not. But do you have evidence or knowledge that the blue cats actually did feed on oyster spat?
So the great thing about my job is that I get a lot of pictures texted to me from a lot of different people. And so I have seen those pictures of spat in blue catfish's stomach.
Right.
I think what we're trying to understand too is, how prevalent is that, right? I guess we keep getting back to the same thing. We know it's a problem and we got to knock it back. And I think it's hard, right? Because we can't say again, in this area, they're having this impact on young oysters, or this area, because they eat everything, right? They're like the garbage disposal at your house. Just put it in, flush it down. And I think that really drives the decision making.
But I mean, it seems like that they've gotten to a size now where their feeding habits have changed to where now here we are with the historic natural spat set. And these blue catfish that are just growing like crazy are starting to feed on them, which is now we're talking about a whole nother issue of concern.
Absolutely.
That we didn't have before that we knew of. Is that true?
Well, I think you look at across all of the species that are economically significant for us, right? Blue catfish or blue crabs, striped bass, it's impacting all of them. Yeah, I would agree with that.
But this was the first year we realized that they were eating spat. Is that right?
This is the first year that I saw pictures of it, but I can talk to the team and see if they've got documentation from previous years.
I'll stop there, Mr. Chairman.
Delegate Foley.
Although I have many more questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for great presentation.
My question, I have two questions. The first one is there anything that we can do as a legislature or as the state of Maryland, maybe administratively or by executive order, whatever, to change the USDA and the way that they look at blue catfish? My understanding is this is a result of catfish, other species of catfish in other parts of the country have kind of led to these regulations. And is there anything that we can do to carve out an exception for the blue catfish, since they are different? You know, they eat different food. They're, you know, they have a different habitat. I just wonder if there's anything we can do.
Yeah, my understanding is right now, because of the way the federal law is written, it's not something we could take state action on. We can look at ways to increase and to incentivize production that then, you know, the problem is it really restricts the market if you don't go through that USDA process, where we could try to incentivize more in-state. But I think the problem there is we're not going to get to the scale we need. And again, to Delegate's point, for those processors to invest in and build out that infrastructure. Now, there's a small few who have done it, but a couple of them are actually paying for the USDA process because they're able to sell to some of those larger institutions. So we're kind of in a bit of a circular pattern that we're working to break out of by both trying to, we are working with our federal delegation to try to change this through the Farm Bill. You know, that advocacy is going to continue. The Chesapeake Bay Commission is an important partner of ours from there. You know, having Virginia and Pennsylvania and Maryland work together on that is critical. But I think for us, it is continue to push our federal delegation and continue to partner with them to push the rest of the federal delegation. And at the same time, figure out how we can continue to incentivize, you know, restaurant purchases, things like that. Grocery stores, we're starting to see grocery stores purchase and sell them in state. So there's kind of multiple layers that we need to push through to be able to build a much larger market.
Thank you. And that brings me to my second question, which is, I actually have been to a couple restaurants in Montgomery County where they have blue catfish on the menu, and you know, as we know, it's quite tasty, and they serve it up really nicely, and they put a lot of polenta and stuff around it, and it's, you know, it's really good, and you generally get a pretty big piece because it's less expensive than rockfish or striped bass. But my question is there any money or is there any program specifically with the state to promote? You keep talking about incentivizing restaurants, incentivizing grocery stores. Is there a program to do that? And maybe if you could just, you know, tell us a little bit about what that program entails.
Sure. Yes.
Delegate, thank you for that question. And I don't want to speak for Department of Agriculture, but, you know, we're working with them hand in hand on this issue of marketing in order to build the market. So we're really focused on working with the watermen and figuring out how we can help them, whether it's funding wise or process wise, with the facilities and equipment and gear and all of that. While MDA is looking at these programs, whether it's funding, grants, or promotional campaigns. And they have a lot of really good ideas that are coming out. So you'll see media, whether it's social media, radio, television, billboards, taste test events, fishing competitions, chef contests that they're really rolling out, recognizing that just the more and more we get a positive sentiment and connotation around eating blue catfish, it can only help. And so together we're hoping that, you know, working both ends of that equation, we can make some real progress.
And just really quickly, I know that they did have an appropriation for Maryland blue catfish to go to supporting local food banks. So I think it offsets the purchase of that local food for the food bank. And I can double check on that appropriation, but I think it was around $1 million.
Oh, that's good. Okay. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Delegate Lehman.
Fair, and thank you for the presentation. I have some questions about pages 9 and 10 under your description of the management, you know, concerns and next steps, the management plan on striped bass. So on page 9, there's a reference to an October 2024 stock assessment. What is the relevance of why wait till October to do that?
Yes, so the stock assessment is the entire coast. It's not just us in Maryland. And so what that's looking at is establishing really an understanding of the health of the coast-wide species. And this is part of I believe, regularly scheduled assessments that happen for each species by ASMFC. So this was always scheduled to be in 2024.
Okay, and does that come under the Magnuson Fisheries Act, or who regulates that, the timing of that? Is that a federal
Yes.
decision? It
Yes.
is, because it involves multiple states?
Correct. Mhm.
Okay, so there's no way to get that moved up, or no rationale?
I don't think so, but we could ask. I don't think so, just because I know they time out, and ASMFC is looking at every species of migratory fish. So that's why they have that schedule set pretty far in advance.
Oh, that makes sense. Okay.
And it relates back, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but it relates back to the data that they will have recently acquired, synthesized, and are then evaluated. So the 2023 data is really important to this assessment. And so they'll be, processing that over these few months and then finalizing it.
Okay.
So I believe it's currently underway.
Okay, thank you for that. I was thinking it was just for striped bass, but that makes sense. So then a couple of questions about page 10 and your description of next steps on bag limits and quotas and all of that. I'm just wondering, can you, or one of you in a position today, and if not today, could follow up on how does the situation right now with striped bass compare to the situation years ago when the fishery was on the verge of collapse? And, we've told this story for years in Maryland. This is one of those great recovery stories. Is it, how close are we to being where we were all those years ago? And where do we have to get to, maybe, and I'm not saying this is the right thing to do, but to close the fishery maybe entirely for a whole season rather than at the edges of April or whatever it is you're proposing. Have you looked at that?
Yep. And that is, I think that the thing about ASMFC is we're trying to take the long-term approach, working together to make sure we never go back to that place, right? So what we're looking at is these incremental regulatory changes to really reduce that mortality. We're not at a place where that wasn't discussed at ASMFC. It wasn't on the table. We're still looking at, the slot limits, bag limits. We haven't even gotten to the more extreme, if you will, measures of season closures at ASMFC yet. So I think where we are, we have a rebounding goal that's due up in 2029. It is beginning to look like we will not make that goal. And so every year ASMFC will continue to reevaluate and make changes across the coast-wide fishery. And so, just like we're making these decisions this year, we'll get the stock assessment in 24. And then the same time next year, the Atlantic State Marine Fisheries Commission will meet and have another conversation. Is it time to look at, some more extreme measures, or are we seeing, a JI that bounces back? And so I think we're not in that kind of crisis area. And the goal of ASMFC is to keep us out of those spaces.
Okay, thank you for that. And one more very quick follow-up, Mr. Chair, if that's okay. What is the relevance of the 5 years? If this fishery has been in decline 5 consecutive years, how important is that? Is 5 years a minimum that you're concerned about? Or does it, again, maybe going back historically when it was at its, most fragile, was it, closer to 10 years? So yeah, if you could talk about that briefly.
Yep. And so, see, can we pull up the JI real quick, or is it? Okay. So if you look at the graph, I'm just going to pull it up. You will see that we have had instances of kind of bottoming out. It's very cyclical because it's such a long-lived fish. One age class can really help significantly rebound the stock and rebuild the stock. And so when you look back into the 70s, 80s, 90s, we had a very long period of time, many, many years where it was depleted and we didn't see a big spike. Right. What you look at and you see recently is the graph really fluctuates.
And what page is that?
That is page 7.
And I thought I was sharing it. Maybe.
Oh,
I
I see.
come back
Okay,
and
I got
help me
you.
share? Sorry.
So because we haven't had that very long depressed, lack of abundant or juvenile age classes, that's why it's not like a 5 year that, it's not a set rule of 5 years of very low. We're kind of taking that long-term approach. And what we're doing in the GillNet survey that we were just discussing is we're not only looking at the reproductive success of these females, but we're also getting an idea of what the age structures are. So how many fish are we still seeing from that 2017, that 2018 year classes that are in the system? And so what you will see is kind of these like big banner years, and then those fish will be kind of of the meat of the population for a long time. And so it's really balancing long-term ebbs with big flows that we're looking at to be kind of concerned about the species.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I do not see any other questions, but Mr. Secretary, I'm hoping you can set a meeting with Delegate Jacobs because I know he's restraining himself for the good of the schedule here. So
Be happy
thank you,
to.
Delegate Jacobs. Thank you to the Secretary and DNR. We appreciate it, colleagues. Before we transition, we need to sort of reset the system. So we'll take a 5-minute break and come back on at 2:35. All right. Thank you.